Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at parapsychology at the Rhine Research Center and the Rhine Education Center. These are organizations carrying on the parapsychology tradition inaugurated by Professor Joseph Banks Rhine, who worked at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and who put the words extrasensory perception on the map with his popular books written in the 1930s. My guest is John G. Kruth, who is the executive director of the Rhine Research Center and the founder of the Rhine Education Center. He's been studying parapsychology informally for over 35 years and has been a formal member of the Rhine Research team since 2009. His research has included studies related to energetic healing methods, bioenergy signatures, out-of-body experiences, qualitative case studies, and mind-matter interactions, as well as poltergeist phenomena. He is a business leader, an educator, and a parapsychologist, and he considers himself one of the lucky people who is truly living his dream. This interview is being conducted via the internet, so now I'm going to switch over to the Skype video. Welcome, John. It's a pleasure to be with you. You've been now the executive director at the Rhine Center for almost a decade.
Well, for about 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting close to a decade.
Yeah. And you've been on the staff even before that.
Oh, yeah. I was doing research at the Rhine. It's been, that's been closer to 9 years, almost 10.
Mm-hmm. So I think a good starting point for us would be to talk a little bit about the person for whom the Rhine Center is named, J.B. Rhine. A lot of people these days may be barely aware of who he was and what he accomplished, but I can say growing up, he was like a towering figure for me. Even as a child, I remember first learning about his work because it was being reported on network television back in the 1950s when I was a kid growing up. And he achieved international fame back in the 1930s.
Yes. And, it's strange to me that people don't know about J.B. Rhine because I also knew about him when I was growing up in the 70s and in the 80s because he was all over the TV. He was in radio early on as well. J.B. Rhine started as a young biologist who was out in the University of Chicago. He and his wife, Louisa Rhine, and they got interested in parapsychology through listening to Arthur Conan Doyle give a talk at the University of Chicago. Mm. Well, whenever they heard him speak, he was speaking not about Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, is a man who did the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, but he wasn't speaking about Sherlock Holmes. He was speaking about work he was doing with the Society for Psychical Research in the UK. He was studying mediums.
In fact, he was a spiritualist himself.
Yes, and he was studying mediums, and J.B. Rhine heard him speak in Chicago in the 1920s and got very intrigued by the work he was doing, went home to his wife and said, I'm wondering if we could study this in the laboratory. So he started to call people around the country who he knew were also into this type of study and started to learn more about what was involved in the scientific end of studying mediums. Well, eventually one of the people who was speaking to came down to Duke University, and he called J.B. Rhine and said, hey, would you like to come down and be on my staff as a psychologist at Duke University, and you can study mediums here?
I presume you're talking about William Mcdougall.
Yes, William Mcdougall. He was up at Harvard, and when Duke University started, he was one of the first people they recruited to come down and head the psychology department. Mm-hmm. So J.B. Rhine and his wife, as the story goes, they packed up their car and took their last $300 and got on the road to North Carolina. As they were driving down, they came down through Virginia and they saw a sign for a psychic course, which we can go into later if you want to. But they ended up coming on down into Durham. And as I hear the story from Sally Rhine Feather, J.B. Rhine's daughter, who still comes to the Rhine quite often, her mom turned to her dad and said, "You've brought me to a town that doesn't even have a bookstore." This was in 1927 in Durham, North Carolina. Well, they eventually did get hooked up with Duke University, and J.B. started looking into mediums. Took about 6 or 7 years, but J.B. realized that you couldn't really study mediums without knowing a little bit about the limits of human abilities. So he started to think about, well, what if these people who seem to be getting information from mediums actually aren't getting it from spirits, and they aren't getting it from the spirits that are departed, but maybe they're getting it from other people. Maybe there's some mind-to-mind communication going on, telepathy. Or perhaps they might be getting information about something that might be in another area. For example, I might have, if you're talking to me about my Uncle Joe who passed away a number of years ago, it might be that I have Uncle Joe's library at my house, and it has his bowling trophies and, has his smoking jacket and his little bottle of gin in a bottom drawer. And maybe from a distance, you're able to get this information. Clairvoyance, remote viewing, being able to see from a distance. Or perhaps in about a half hour, I'm going to tell you everything there is to know about Uncle Joe. And you're able to get some information about what I'm going to say in the future. Precognition, getting information through time. So JB realized that before he could study mediums and know if they were talking to spirits, he first had to realize, are these other abilities real? And can we determine what the limitations of them are? This is where he started to study what he called extrasensory perception. And in 1935, he wrote a monograph called Extrasensory Perception that just took the world by storm. It was a scientific approach to these phenomena that hadn't been done in this way before. When he published his monograph, it hit the New York Times bestseller list. It was very, very popular, and he started to do a lot of radio and media appearances. Later on, TV, as it got into the 50s and into the 60s. And he became really the expert on this field.
In fact, to my recollection, I had the privilege of meeting J.B. Rhine when I first started out in parapsychology back in 1973. I visited Durham and met him then.
We had a bookstore by then, I think, right?
I'm not sure about
there were bookstores in Durham, I think.
but he had the stamp of the psychology department at Duke University, which is, considered a formidable university. And I gather that he became the most famous professor in the psychology department there, and it caused a certain amount of tension amongst the other psychologists.
Well, by the time you got there in 1973, yes, it was they had actually left Duke University by that time. That's moved off campus and founded a nonprofit called the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man.
That's where I visited him, yes.
Yes, but it was right across the street from Duke University, literally across the street in a little house just across the street from the university.
And you're still in Durham now.
Yes, we're still in Durham. We're now called the Rhine Research Center. We've changed the name back in 1995 in honor of J.B. Rhine's, I think it was his 100th birthday, actually, in 1995. And so we changed the name at that point, but we're still doing the same sort of research. We're still looking into parapsychology and consciousness and trying to explore human experiences in the context of these exceptional experiences that people have.
Now, the institute that he founded when he left Duke University proper, the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man, I gather that name implied that he thought there's something about the research he was doing in parapsychology, which is the name that he chose for that discipline, that it told us something about human nature itself. Something I think he was getting at was the spiritual nature of the human being.
Well, you're right. And, one of the things that J.B. Rhine was very famous for is he did not like to focus on exceptional people. He liked to do general population studies. He would study, and rather than taking someone who really performed really well and taking them into the lab and seeing how they did, J.B. often would say, let's just do a survey of all the people that we can get, do large sample sizes, because he felt it was a natural outgrowth of human beings that we had these abilities. He didn't think it was anything unusual. And some of the work that Louisa did, his wife, looking at the experiences, once the lab started, people started sending letters, started calling the institute, and started saying, I want to tell you about my experiences. Mm-hmm. And there were so many letters coming in. JB was a scientist. He was working at the university as an academic. He couldn't keep up with all of the letters and phone calls and everything that was coming in. So one day, his wife, Louisa, who was also a botanist, mm-hmm. She was a PhD botanist. She said, well, let me look at it. Let me take a look at it. She started to look at the letters and started to classify them as a botanist would, right? Yeah. Started to put them in some sort of order and classification and creating a taxonomy for them. And over a period of time, it became apparent these were so common. So many people talked about these. It was obviously part of man's natural nature. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where JB went whenever he was naming the foundation.
We should talk a little bit about the kind of studies that he did. He was known for using a deck of cards known as Zener cards and having his research subjects guess which card would come up after the deck was shuffled.
Right. Yes, they used Zener cards at first. And Zener cards were invented. You would wonder, why wouldn't they use a regular deck of cards if they were trying to guess cards? But the problem with regular cards is sometimes they can look very similar. Mm. If you have a jack or a king, if you just get a quick glance at it or you just see it very quickly in passing, you might not get a clear impression of what it is. So they wanted to come up with some very distinct symbols. So they used 5 different symbols. One of them was a circle. Another one was a wavy lines, a square, a star. And what was the fifth one, Jeff? Now it's
a circle, a square, a wavy line, and a star. And was it a cross?
Cross. Yes, yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. I forgot the one that had 2. Yes. Yeah. And they did these for multiple reasons. One of them because if you look at them, they're very distinct and very different symbols. The other is they had a bit of a representation a lot of people don't notice. A circle is actually a single continuous line. 1. A cross is 2 lines. The wavy lines, there's 3 of them. Mm-hmm. The square has 4 corners and 4 lines. And then the star has 5 points on it. So it had a numerical value as well. So depending upon how people got information, it wasn't clear how people were going to get information using their extrasensory perception, as he called it. One of the other reasons they used these cards is because it was really easy to evaluate statistically. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is back in the 1930s, the idea of probability theory was just developing in statistics and growing in popularity as well. J.B. Rhine was using cutting-edge statistical methodology in order to evaluate his research results. So what he'd do is he'd have one person sit on one side with these really unique cards, one side of a screen, and they would say, they would start turning cards over. Another person on the other side of the screen would start trying to guess what the cards were. And they'd keep records of how many they got right out of a deck of 25, 5 cards, 5 of each card. Mm-hmm. Now, if you do this one time and you get, let's say you would normally expect people to get 1 out of 5 right, so you expect 5 out of 25.
By chance.
By chance, yes. But if they were to get maybe 6 or 7, that's not really that much of a variance statistically. You have to really get closer to 9, and then you get about 90% chance that you're doing better than really what probability will predict. Or if you got 11, then you're getting closer to 99%. But if you run through one time and you get 11 right, that doesn't prove that you have psychic abilities. Of course, they had to go through many, many trials. And JB and his colleagues at the lab went through thousands and thousands and thousands of runs of cards like this in order to, and they did find that people did seem to be able to guess better than chance.
As I recall, on average, people might score 6 hits rather than 5, which over thousands of trials becomes enormously statistically significant.
Right, but it actually, the numbers that I saw were higher, that they would eventually, over a long period of time, the numbers would get higher and they do much better. And they did have some exceptional performers as well. And although JB thought this was a very common thing for many people, there were some people who started out just doing so phenomenally well that it gave him sense that there was something to continue studying here. And it drove his work from the 1930s on through the 1960s at Duke University. Then they started to go into some different areas as they moved off campus in 1965 and started the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man.
And of course, over that time, we had the computer revolution. We had, he faced an onslaught of scientific criticism. I'm well aware of that. And, he was very diligent about improving the research methodology and responding, in detail to every criticism that had been raised. As I recall, in 1940, he and his colleagues published a book called ESP After 60 Years, in which they published every single criticism that had ever been mentioned in the literature, and they had a response for every single one and a list of experiments that they felt had answered all the criticisms as well. One would have thought, that the matter was put to rest in 1940. But, of course, as you and I both know, the criticisms continue to this very day. There are a lot of people in the scientific community who refuse to accept this data, no matter what.
Oh, yes. And it's been like that from the beginning. As one of the most striking things in the ESP, what we call ESP 60, ESP After 60 Years, one of the most striking things in that book, to me, is their evaluation of the Pierce-Pratt series that they did. Yeah. One of the major criticisms was that there was some way that people were either giving cues to another person as they were turning the cards over, or the people were able to see something. They were able to get information from the researcher while they were doing the experiment. So, and not only this, but they wanted to see, is there any limit to how far people can be apart and still get this information? So they set up an experiment on Duke University campus where the researcher was in one building and there was a participant who was in another building. It was over 300 yards away. And they ran the experiments from that distance to see if there was no way that they could have seen each other. And there was no way they were communicating with each other back in the 1930s. And still the results came out significant. When this was published, it was phenomenal because it seemed to be definitive proof that there was no cueing going on. But, of course, and they answered this in the ESP 60 book, but of course, there were skeptical researchers who continued to find criticisms and say things like, oh, well, what happened is the participant ran down the quad, ran into the building, went up to the researcher's room, and looked through the transom. Now, we don't have transoms anymore, but this is the little window that was at the top of the doorway, climbed on a ladder and looked in and could see the researcher and was writing down the responses according to what the cards were turning. Now, this is it's ridiculous to think that someone would do this and not be seen while they were doing it. But this is the lengths that people were going to, even back in 1940, to try to dismiss the results that JB were getting. And of course, as you said, we still see this today.
We do, because I think for some people it's simply axiomatic that extrasensory perception is impossible, and therefore people who report experimental data of this sort must be deceiving themselves in one way or another, or deliberately trying to deceive other people.
Right. Yes. Yes, the question comes up of whether, there's a flaw in the methodology. If that doesn't pan out, then it starts to go into, is there a flaw in the statistical analysis methods? And, this continues to become more and more prevalent in our research.
Yeah. Well, in addition to extrasensory perception, J.B. Rhine also began exploring psychokinesis.
Yes. Yes, and this is one of the things he didn't publish in his original monograph, Extrasensory Perception. He was doing experiments. Well, the story goes that it was back when the labs got very popular and people found out about it. There was a man who came into the lab and said, "Hey, I'm a gambler, and I can control the roll of dice." Well, JB, of course, was working with cards, and he wasn't working with dice at that period of time. And, but he was open, and he said, "Okay, well, show me what you can do." Well, he did find that the man did seem to get the numbers that he wanted to come up. So JB started to design the experiment so it would be less human-oriented. They started to use little cups to shake the dice and roll them. Then they started to have them rolled independently, and they actually created an automatic dice rolling machine. Mm-hmm. We have one of them in the Rhine Library right now, which is a big machine. It's a plexiglass and has a bunch of dice in it, and it turns over with a really loud motor, and it would spill the dice, and people would try to get certain numbers to come up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, after a lot of trials, JB discovered, yes, people do seem to be able to get the numbers that they're interested in more than you would expect by probability or chance. Mm-hmm. Like I said, he didn't publish this in his original monograph, ESP, or Extrasensory Perception, because he knew that it was going to be hard enough for people to accept ESP. To accept that people could also control physical objects, material objects in the world, that was going to take a lot more research and a lot more foundational work before he could turn that up. So he reported that in ESP 60 as well.
Mm-hmm.
That work continued, and that was psychokinesis, which he added to ESP and became known as Psi. All of those phenomena, ESP phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis, are now called Psi.
Mm-hmm. When I use the word Psi, I like to suggest, and probably J.B. Rhine wasn't thinking this way, but it seems to me that, evidence for survival after death and reincarnation also somehow are part of that umbrella.
Well, they're obviously part of parapsychology, and it's part of what we study in the field. Mm-hmm. When we use it in research papers, we tend to separate Psi from survival research so that we can identify these one phenomena. But of course, if there are spirits that are communicating with mediums, they're not doing it with any material means. They have to be using telepathy. There has to be some sort of Psi phenomena occurring as well at that point. So it does make sense to bring them together.
And in fact, there are people, as you know, who would argue that even the very best evidence for survival and reincarnation could be reinterpreted as a form of living agent Psi.
Oh, yes, that's very, very common. Yeah. There are many, many parapsychologists who follow that.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I visited the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man back in 1973, I was very impressed. They had giant computers, mainframe computers in the facility. And I met the director of the foundation at the time, a fellow named Jay Levy, who was doing this very, very impressive study with mice and rats to see if they would use extrasensory perception to avoid getting electrical shocks. And it appeared to be highly scientific, and the results were coming in and looked really good. People were very excited. Now we have a replicable experiment that could be performed in any biology laboratory in the world. They don't have to be believers in the phenomenon. And then tragically, it was discovered that Levy himself was actually doctoring the data. There was a degree of fraud involved. It was a big setback, I think, for J.B. Rhine.
Yes. And as I remember, Jay Levy was a young man.
Yeah.
And he was very intrigued with the field, and he was trained in the medical field as well. Mm-hmm. And he was trying to look at different signals that were coming from the brain of the rats. And he had wired the equipment so that it would pick up the signals from the rats' brains and record whether they were making decisions to go one way or go another way, or based or have a certain reward-based mechanism and seeing if they could use if they were indicating ESP. What was interesting about it was an animal study, which corresponded with the medical studies at that time. And it seemed to be incredible evidence to the point that J.B. Rhine actually stepped back and named Jay Levy as the director of the Rhine Research Center for a period of time, or the foundation at that time. Yeah. Institute for Parapsychology actually is what he was a director of for a period. But it was discovered at a later point that Jay Levy was actually removing the sensors from the rats and crossing them and causing signals on a very consistent basis. When they analyzed the data independently and they saw this, they realized what the problem was. This is something we don't often talk about at the Rhine, but what was very impressive to me about it is that as soon as it was discovered, J.B. Rhine dedicated an entire issue of the Journal of Parapsychology to writing a retraction and talking about the fact that these studies need to be removed from the literature. We cannot accept these anymore. And of course, he fired Jay Levy on the spot as soon as he found fraud involved. Mm-hmm. This is one of the things, the integrity of the scientists, especially working in a controversial field like the one we're working in. It's essential in order to maintain the progress of the science. And JB recognized that. And JB took the steps immediately to retract all of the articles that Jay Levy had contributed to the field.
Well, speaking of fraud, which of course has always been kind of the bane of parapsychologists, because accusations of fraud have always been there, and especially in the days of 19th century spiritualism, there were many fraudulent mediums in that era. In fact, one of the reasons Rhine began doing experiments was to create conditions that would make fraud difficult, if not impossible. Mm-hmm. Certainly, at least in terms of the research subjects. When the experimenters themselves engage in fraud, that's another matter. But there was an important historical episode in which Rhine himself was accused of fraud by the eminent physicist John Wheeler, and it was published in, as I recall, Science, the mainstream publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and Wheeler ended up having to retract that accusation and apologize to Rhine.
Yes, that was in the late 70s, I believe. Is that right, Jeff?
Yeah,
Yes. Mm-hmm. It was in the late 70s that John Wheeler had written a scathing article that discussed all of J.B. Rhine's work. First of all, said that it wasn't accurate, and then talked about how he could have done fraudulent work and how he could have manipulated the data. Yeah. Of course, it didn't stand up to scrutiny. And it did not fit with J.B. Rhine's character, especially after you look at the Levy situation and how quickly he responded, and how much integrity he had and how much respect he had from all of the other academics at Duke University. I mean, there are so many stories about J.B. Rhine walking into a room at Duke University where they're having a symposium, and he would walk in and people would stand up and give him a standing ovation because of the groundbreaking research that he was doing. I mean, his work was so well known, and he was such a good person to present this work to the world. This is the legacy that we try to maintain at the Rhine today. We still continue to do this groundbreaking research. We try to maintain the highest level of integrity. But beyond this, Jeff, why did you come to Durham? Because it was the place where the best research was being done and you could learn the most about the field. Mm-hmm. We are trying to continue this role of being educators, providing legitimate information with high integrity to the field, helping new students, new people who are interested in the field to learn from people who are really doing the work. Yeah. And rather than getting it from the internet where there is so much different information available, we are trying to maintain the voice of integrity within the field.
Well, and you also continue to publish the Journal of Parapsychology, which, to my knowledge, has been published continuously now since the 1930s.
Since 1937. That was the first issue. Mm-hmm. And it's been continuously published since then, yes. Mm-hmm.
So that's a very important function that you've been able to maintain. What are some of the other projects that are currently going on there?
Well, at the Rhine, we talk about having four legs on the stool here. One of them is research, which we're doing constant research in the field. The other is education. We have the Rhine Education Center, where we offer classes online to people around the world. We have certificate programs that people can learn more about the field as well. We also talk about support and resources. We have resources that no one else in the field has because we have such a long history. We do have a record of the journals going all the way back to 1937. We have a large library at the Rhine. We have lots of artifacts from some of the early days as well. And finally is community. This, to me, is one of the more important parts of what we're doing with the Rhine now. There are so many people who have experiences who don't have anywhere to go to talk about them.
Yeah.
If they do discuss it with their family or their friends, a lot of times either they're met with dumb stares or they're ridiculed even for their beliefs or what their experiences are. And people are looking for information. They're trying to understand what is it that we're going through. Your work you're doing here, Jeff, is so important for these people. It gives them something to found their beliefs in and their knowledge of the field. It gives them a way that they can learn more about what other people are going through. And we're trying to maintain that at the Rhine as well, providing this community of people who are having experiences and researchers who want to know more about what's been going on in the field.
Because there are very few opportunities for people to become professional parapsychologists to get the training. I mean, I got a doctoral degree that says parapsychology, but to my knowledge, it's the only one ever awarded anywhere in the world. And I was fortunate at the University of California to have mentors like Charlie Tart and Michael Scriven, who had already established themselves in the parapsychology community, and at a time when parapsychology was really taking off in California. If that hadn't been the case, there would have been no possibility that I could have pursued this direction myself.
Exactly. And, personally, whenever I wanted to learn about the professional field, I had to do all the research on my own because there were no university studies. There was no place to learn about it. By the time that I had gotten around in the late 80s and through the 90s, there were no university programs anymore. JFK University had closed their program in parapsychology by that point, and that was the only one that I knew of that was left. I eventually did come to this area around Durham because I heard that there were some classes being taught at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and that there were possibility of getting some classes at Duke University, but there was nothing available by the time I got to this area. This is why it was 7 years ago now. Christine Simmonds-Moore, who is now a professor at the University of West Georgia, and she was at the Rhine about 7 years ago, and we were having a discussion. We were saying there's no place for people to learn about this. What can we do? And we sat down together and we said, we need to start a school. We need to find a way that people can start to learn these things and have a legitimate source. So I had come from a technology background. I had 20 years of working in software development and computer technology. Christine was a parapsychologist who had taught Introduction to Parapsychology and other courses at university. We took these and married them together and created the Rhine Education Center. It's an online school where people can apply and get education from professional parapsychologists, people who have experience in different areas of the field. And we've been going strong since 2011. We've expanded it quite a bit. And as I was mentioning, we do have certificate programs in different ways so you can actually learn not about how to be psychic. I really loved your book, Psi Development Systems. It gave a lot of information about how people learn about psi phenomena and how to develop it. We are actually trying to teach people how to study people who have these phenomena, how to study the phenomena. We are teaching people to be scientific parapsychologists within this field. And it's, like I said, it's been going on for a number of years. And it's one of the things I'm most proud of, that we've been able to expand the community, and we actually have some parapsychologists who are now working in the field who've taken courses through our programs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do recall in earlier years there was something called the summer program. People would come for maybe 3 months of very intensive work at the Institute of Parapsychology, as it was then known.
Right. Yes, and John Palmer was one of the people. John Palmer's a researcher, has been in the field since the 1960s, and he was one of the people who ran the education program at the Rhine, and they would bring parapsychologists from all over the world into Durham, and they would spend a month, 2 months, a number of months, a good amount of time here, and people would also come from all over the world to learn about parapsychology from these researchers, learn about the most current research that's being done, learn about how they can maybe possibly make a move into the field. And that worked really, really well. And there were a lot of parapsychologists came from that program. I was in Durham while these programs were going on, but I had a job. I couldn't take 3 months off in the middle of the summer to attend one of these programs. And it became clear to me whenever, as I became a professional and doing different work, I needed to find a way that I could study this outside of what a standard academic structure would be. Mm-hmm. This is why we started online programs. What we have now with the Rhine Education Center is an evolution from the summer study program when people would actually come and be in Durham. You can do it from anywhere in the world. Yeah. And you can do it at any time because it's all online. But we do have hopes of having another practicum kind of thing where we might have people come to Durham and spend time in a lab. I have had students who have come to Durham, and we've done some, little bit of lab work with them just to get them some hands-on experience as well working in the lab. We hope to expand that in the future. Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you this. How would you evaluate the state of parapsychology now in 2018? Well, the year's almost over, 2018, 2019, probably right. Before I release this particular video. But, after it's been now almost 90 years since J.B. and Louisa Rhines began this parapsychology research program. I imagine that they themselves at one time had expected that every psychology department in the world would be doing parapsychology experiments, and that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, but what is interesting is that there are more parapsychology courses that are starting to be taught at universities in different parts of the country. Mm-hmm. And people from other departments, for example, out in Colorado, Garrett Mcdougall is in the physics department, and he's teaching parapsychology to his students there. I've met his students at different conferences, and there are some really, really excellent, very clear thinking and very critically thinking people that are starting to come into the field. And they're young, Jeff. Yeah. This is the nice thing. They're young people. So often I've sat around the Rhine and look around the table, and I'm one of the younger people in the room. And that's not good because, I'm not a young person anymore. Yeah. But when we start to bring in people who are in their 20s and 30s, this is going to be the future of the field. They're the ones who are going to be pulling us into what the newest research is going to be, and bringing in the newer technology. It was really hopeful. Just last summer, in the summer of 2018, whenever I went to some conferences, I saw so many young people, not only sitting in the audience to listen to the conference material that was being presented, but actually presenting their own research. Yeah. This gives me hope. And I mentioned Christine Simmonds-Moore, who's now teaching at West Georgia University. She is in their psychology department teaching courses in parapsychology. This is pretty unique in the United States. It happens more in other countries. In UK, there's still a big growth of parapsychology research based on some work that was done by Bob Morris back in the 1980s and 90s that's continued to grow now. And Chris Rowe is continuing to teach parapsychology and produce a number of different PhD students who are focusing on parapsychology.
Of course, all of these are important and hopeful signs, but I remember back in the 70s, I was one of those young people. Yes. And And at the time, a book was published called Education in Parapsychology. It listed like 200 college courses in parapsychology that were being offered back then. It seemed like that was going to be the revolution, and then it kind of fizzled out. So today, maybe there are a dozen or two courses.
Yeah, right. So it's we are definitely in a different type of landscape now.
Yeah.
But it seems to be filtering into other fields. One of the things that has really shaken the world of physics, as we get further and further into quantum physics, we realize that our foundation of a materialistic world doesn't mesh with the reality of what's being observed.
Yeah.
And it's being observed on a very, very small microscopic level. That non-locality is definitely occurring. And by this, I mean that objects, particles that are separated by long distances, are still responding as if they are connected, as if there's a single particle. And there's no detectable mechanism that they could be communicating. And it doesn't seem to degrade or become delayed as distance gets further and further apart. This speaks to the fact that there is no signal being sent between the two objects. So how is the information occurring? Now, it is on a microscopic level. It's hard to scale this up, but it's becoming more and more prevalent within the world of physics that they're looking for a new model. And it's very possible that consciousness is going to start to become an integral part of physics. This, I think, is where J.B. Rhine was starting so many years ago. This is not about some specialized field that's separate from all the others. It is part of human experience. It's part of our understanding of the world. And this is the way that I see it growing, not by parapsychology growing and becoming as popular as it was in the 1940s and 50s, but by parapsychology creeping slowly into the other different fields and slowly people picking up on it and consciousness becoming integral to the other fields.
I agree with you. I think that's exactly what's happening right now, that people in many, many different disciplines recently saw a report about consciousness amongst ants and ant colonies, for example. But I think one of the problems with the Rhinean approach to parapsychology is embodied in the very word or phrase extrasensory perception. It implies an organ of perception. It implies a channel by which perceptual information is communicated over vast distances and over time. And we have yet to discover an organ of perception or a communication channel. So it may be that it's not really a perceptual phenomenon at all, even though it seems to mimic perception in some ways.
Yes, you're right. There could be some, whether there is a biological or physical organ of some sort, or whether there's another mechanism. No one's found it yet, and people have looked intensely for it. People have talked about the pineal gland, and perhaps this is the seat of consciousness where people can get information. But it's never really been the mechanisms that you might find in biology or in medicine. We haven't found those related to extrasensory perception. We have done some studies that seem to correlate some physical energies with some phenomena, though. One of the studies we do at the Rhine is related to something that we call biophotons. And I say we call biophotons. No, it's not it's not parapsychologists. This is biology. Biophotons are ultraviolet light and that are produced from organic matter. People, animals, even cells. We took some red blood cells, and if you put a little bit of saline on red blood cells, they pop. Well, we found that as these red blood cells popped, they produced ultraviolet light. They were released.
Photons, in effect.
Yes, photons. Yes, they were producing in the ultraviolet range. These biophotons are something that, like I said, it's biology. This is not parapsychology. But what we've done at the Rhine is we've discovered that when some people are performing what they call energy healing or psychic healing, we see biophotons correlated with their activities. We also find people who are doing martial arts who talk about manipulating chi and having an effect on chi, we find that as they're doing their martial arts forms, we're seeing biophotons being produced. We find this with people who are doing meditation, who often talk about kundalini energies rising. So when we talk about energy and we talk about energy healing and these sorts of things, most physicists or biologists, material scientists would say, look, there's potential energy and there's kinetic energy. You're not talking about either one of these. So I don't know what kind of energy you're talking about. But what we are finding is light, which is electromagnetic energy. It's very possible that this energy that people have been talking about experiencing, moving, the chi energy that martial artists talk about, it's very possible that that energy may be related to the biophotons that we're finding in our lab. So there may be some physical information carrier waves that might be occurring, and they may not only occur locally, they can also occur non-locally. So there may be a bridge that we're looking at, and this is what we're always doing in parapsychology. We're trying to find the bridge where we can say, these are the human experiences. How can we describe these human experiences in a way that we can understand within our material sciences and expand our methodologies so that we're not only looking at material sciences?
I think it's encouraging that you're always thinking creatively and exploring new avenues. And I know that you yourself are listed as a co-author on several papers relating to the biophoton research.
Yes, it's the lab. That's my lab now that I'm doing. We had some of the original research was done. I worked with Bill Joines and Steve Bauman, who had set up the lab originally. But I've been working on it now for the past 6 years.
Well, John Kruth, it's been a real pleasure sharing this time with you and learning about your work at a very important historical institution that is still sort of a mainstay of parapsychology today. Thank you so much for being with me.
Boy, I didn't think we were done already, Jeff. I feel like we have so much more we could talk about, but I'm sure you get this very often because you're so easy to talk to. Thank you very much for inviting me today.
It's a pleasure, and I look forward to future conversations with you as well.
Great, Jeff.